welcome to the 36th episode of the Veggies Abroad Vegan Travel Podcast with the chief veggie pusher, myself, Rebecca Gady-Swicky. Some of you may already be familiar with Veggies Abroad, but for those of you who aren't, we're a full-service vegan travel company that offers custom planning services, small group trips, a helpful blog chock full of just about everything a vegan or veg-curious traveler could possibly need, and this podcast. With this podcast, I aim to amplify the voices of businesses championing vegan and vegan-friendly options, responsible tourism practices, the environment, community impact, all things we need more of and must actively support. So, speaking of support, I don't know about you, but for most of my traveling life, I assumed that if I spent $1 in a destination, then that dollar or most of that dollar supported that place. I mean, why wouldn't it, right? That makes total sense. It never once crossed my mind that maybe only 50 cents or 5 cents even actually stayed there. This concept is called tourism leakage, and we're going to dive headfirst into it today. But I have a little homework for you once you finish this episode. Go find the documentary, The Last Tourist. It looks like it's available on Apple TV and Hulu, among a couple other streaming platforms, depending on where you live. It covers all the different ways in which tourism has lost its way and many things that have become normalized that we need to question if we're trying to be more responsible travelers, including tourism leakage. Some of the things in the documentary we've touched on with different interviews in this podcast, or will in the months to come. Once you watch it, I want to know what you think. Did any of it surprise you? Were you just baffled? Shoot me an email or a message on social media. Tell me everything. I want to know. Now, with all things that challenge our thinking and the ways in which we've always operate, I know it can feel difficult and impossible. I'd encourage you to take it one step at a time. Like with so many things, it's not about perfection. It is about being better and each time making better decisions, all of which eventually creates a snowball of impact. Before we jump into today's chat, I have a couple of fantastic updates for you. We have announced our first tour for 2026, and it's a big one. Next August, we will head to Ecuador to explore Quito, venture to a local community, and experience the beauty of the Galapagos. If you're thinking, how in the world did I miss that announcement? It means you're probably not on our newsletter. With all of the trips, I announce them there first. All of those people, they get first dibs. So in the event that a tour sells out because everyone on the newsletter just can't wait to go, then anybody who wasn't there just doesn't get the opportunity or gets stuck on the waiting list. You can join by visiting our website or clicking on the link in the show notes. More trips will be announced soon, and to keep things moving, I will be announcing them as soon as they are confirmed. So keep your eyes and ears open. We do still have spaces available for our Portugal trip in October of this year, 2025, and our second Thailand trip of this December. And all of the details for all of those trips for either this year or next are on the website. So check those out. If you have questions, don't ever hesitate to reach out. And as always, if you're enjoying this podcast, take a minute and leave a rating. Those little stars make a difference. I know it's an easy thing to overlook or forget, but it impacts search algorithms and people's perceptions if something is truly worthwhile. So give it a click, will ya? Okay, so joining me today to chat about tourism leakage is Susanna Sooz Shanker, the founder and editor-in-chief of Curiosity Saves Travel, a travel blog and resource dedicated to sustainability and regenerative tourism. She has 15 years of experience in the industry, starting as a local Alaska tour guide, and most recently, she's approached tourism with an academic lens, studying the intersection of travel and the natural environment. She has a Master of Science in Biodiversity, and her research specializes in using nature-based solutions to help manage some of tourism's negative impacts. These solutions foster more resilient communities and nature while delivering more equitable economic benefits. Susanna Sooz was born and raised in Alaska, but has since left home. She moved abroad to Munich, Germany for 7 years before finally settling in Vancouver, Canada. She's a veggie traveler who loves finding veganized versions of traditional foods. Let's chat with Sooz. thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation as I think it's one that people are going to be really surprised by. Most people think all tourism is really fabulous and great and beneficial and an amazing economic driver, but what they don't realize is that there are many places around the world that suffer from the burdens of tourism and get very little benefit of it. So let's jump in a little bit with kind of like the background and kind of like set up the economic side of how tourism leakage fits into tourism.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on here. I'm really excited to be here to talk about tourism leakage today. If my old economics professor, could see me now talking about economics and tourism, I'm sure they would be so proud of me. So when we discuss tourism's kind of more negative impacts, I think the economic aspect is very rarely talked about in this more negative light. And I think that's because tourism is incredibly lucrative. It contributes about 10% of global GDP, give or take the year. But that number can be much higher in places like Aruba, where it's about 20%, or it could be much lower. In the United States, it's only about 3% of the GDP. But because tourism is such an economic powerhouse, the industry really tends to hyper-focus on these financial benefits. You talked a lot about us as travelers. I think we're, so much like we're going to travel, we're spending money, therefore it's inherently good. And that's not always the case. So this kind of enticing economic promise often justifies pursuing tourism development full steam ahead without stopping to look at maybe more social or cultural or environmental impacts, or if that model of economic development is equitable and inclusive for tourism and those beyond tourism. And I think undoubtedly tourism is a very powerful tool for poverty alleviation, and to help us deliver on these sustainable development goals. But I think when we kind of maybe remove those rose-colored glasses, we start to see kind of that not every model of tourism is as equitable as it seems. And this is primarily a result of poorly managed or unregulated tourism that can contribute to tourism leakage.
And I actually, as you were talking about this, I think it would be really interesting to know, not just for everyone listening, but for me as well, how in the world did you get interested into this side of tourism?
Yeah, so I've been in the travel and tourism industry for quite a while, and most recently I've kind of looked at tourism more from an academic approach. So I went back to school in my mid-30s for a master's in biodiversity, and I think during that program I actually maybe thought I was going to leave tourism behind, but I found this really unique opportunity to kind of be a bridge between the environmental aspects of tourism and the industry itself. And so a lot of the research that I did looked at more negative impacts from tourism, or these adverse impacts, of which the economic aspects like leakage was one of them. And I was kind of looking at some solutions of ways that we can alleviate these impacts. And so I think seeing these more negative impacts kind of show up in some of my research was surprising to me, because in my early years of travel, I really looked at tourism as kind of this inherently good, I'm spending money, it's good approach. And it kind of made me stop and step back and think about how I'm spending money and how that's contributing to kind of meaningful model of tourism. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into the economic elements of this.
Interesting. Yeah. And I do think your economics professor would be very proud of you right now. So let's dive back into tourism leakage specifically. What the heck is it?
Yeah, so I think since tourism, right, is so lucrative on paper, we talked about this, that many of us really want to believe that every dollar we spend stays in the local community. I think the reality is not quite as optimistic. So tourism leakage is when the money we spend while traveling leaks out of a destination. So this diminishes the economic benefits that stay in place as we travel. So tourism dollars may fail to reach local communities. They may fail to circulate throughout the entire economy or supply chains. It may end up in the pockets of large international kind of tourism conglomerates, or in the hands of global kind of food and beverage companies. So we really want to look at, not only does tourism contribute 10% of GDP, but we want to look at how that is being spent and what it's contributing to in terms of Is it improving the quality of lives of the people at the destination? Is it contributing to meaningful job growth? So the average for tourism leakage is about 50% globally. So this number varies, but for the sake of this example, we'll stick to this 50%. Now, moving into this hypothetical situation. So suppose you travel somewhere and you spend $100. I wish trips were $100, right. But let's say you spend $100 total. You're staying at an all-inclusive 5-star resort owned by like a multinational hotel corporation. At a 50% leakage rate, that means automatically $50 is going to this hotel that's incorporated overseas, the airline with a crew that may reside elsewhere, hotel amenities such as soap may be imported, the hotel bar may stock Coca-Cola products. So that really only leaves $50 that is retained locally, and that is primarily by those that are working in tourism, and we're not really distributing this to other sectors like agriculture or transportation. So this kind of contributes to an inflated look at these economic benefits of tourism. And it kind of adds to this, tourism looks really great on paper, but when we start peeling away these layers, there's some gaps we can identify. And to just quickly note that tourism leakage is a bit of an imprecise term. I think I use it, a lot of tourism researchers and academics use it, so it's not wrong. But what we're really looking at here is tourism's value or supply chains, and how we can focus on improving the domestic value of community through tourism. Yeah.
Another interesting step that I had read is that for every $100 spent for a tourist in a developing country's economy, so this could be like, I don't know, the Caribbean, some parts of Central America, only $5 of it actually stays in the destination, which when I first read that, I think my mind literally blew up.
Yeah, I have a couple of other examples that I think will continue to blow your mind as well. So,
it's crazy. And I've shared that with some of clients and they're like, wait, what? Can you repeat that? I'm like, I know. I'm so sorry to break your heart. I feel like I'm the reverse Santa.
The global average is about 50%. And then that we'll get a little bit into kind of this like unequitable kind of numbers as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're already starting to paint a picture of why this is a problem for destinations. Obviously, money isn't staying within it. So it's not allowing communities to prosper, do well, and, do all the things that we think that we're supporting them. But there are other issues as well too, right?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest problems is, and this is a kind of quick answer, and if we want to dive into this a bit more detail later on, we can. But kind of the nitty gritty of this is entire communities are the ones that are experiencing tourism's more adverse impacts. So whether that's increasing pollution, waste, loss of biodiversity. So, for example, more waste requires more people collecting trash. It requires more trash bins, more garbage trucks, better recycling infrastructure. And in high rates of leakage, the money isn't circulating throughout the community. So they're not really retaining the economic means to help them kind of mitigate or manage these more adverse impacts. And in some cases, the cost of managing the impacts of cruise pollution is 6 to 7 times higher than the economic benefits that some cruise ports actually retain. So some of these communities are actually losing money as they, especially in the era of climate change, as pollution is getting worse. They're actually spending more money trying to kind of manage these impacts than they're receiving as a benefit from tourism. Yeah,
it's crazy. I mean, and then there are other issues like drains on local resources. For instance, like in Greece, water is a huge issue. And tourists don't think about their water usage because they're on vacation and how that's affecting the local community there. Or sewage is another one, which is crazy. Yeah. I was reading about this, I heard about this before we started this episode, and I meant to Google it, but there's actually an island in the Maldives that's kind of become a trash island because of tourism within the Maldives. And I just saw my notes for it, and I, in parentheses, was like, look this up. And of course I didn't.
I believe
it's
it.
Insane.
I mean, waste and sewage is a huge issue. And I think when I started getting more into tourism, kind of looking at this, I guess, through a microscope, I think sewage was never really something I thought that would cost so much. And I was like, wow, tourism has a really big sewage problem. And that is something that never occurred to me. And managing that can be quite costly for some communities.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think and it's always like a good reminder for me when I'm talking with, clients and other people on tours that, people will get bogged down and be like, well, I went to this place and I thought it was going to be gorgeous and blah, blah, blah. And why wasn't it like the postcard, or why wasn't it like what I saw on Instagram? I think it's always a great thing for people to remember, like, one, that's not life, but two, then that gives you the opportunity to peel back a little bit, see what's going on there. Cause there could be issues like this happening there where there isn't enough money coming in to actually manage these issues. And that's incredibly sad and disappointing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times too, we say, oh, well, tourism in the Caribbean contributes like X amount of dollars. Like, why don't they have the money to fund this infrastructure or these resources? And that's where this kind of, the rate at which leakage is occurring is really important to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really crazy. So what are I think we've touched on some of this as well already, but the biggest contributors to tourism leakage, multinational companies have an effect on it, but I know there are more than just that.
Yeah. It's not really like all certain large companies are bad versus good. But we typically see, I think, the highest rates of economic tourism leakage as a result from these large multinational tourism operators, large hotel conglomerates, and large multinational corporations. And I think especially the ones that operate their own global supply chain, or the ones that haven't done the work to build meaningful relationships with local community producers, suppliers, services, community members, or the ones that haven't really done the work to bolster and support that growth locally in places where it might not exist. So we talked about cruises a bit. Typically, they retain about 50% of any onshore excursion. So if you are on a cruise and you book, like a helicopter tour or a kayaking tour, the cruise pretty much almost takes about 50% of what you're paying up front. And this study kind of looked at this happening in Honduras, but I think that's pretty standard across the industry. There was another study that looked at tourism leakage in Bali, and they found that 4 and 5 star resorts, which are typically foreign owned, resulted in about a 51% leakage rate, where non-star rated local hotels only resulted in about a 9% leakage rate. So that's a huge difference in just kind of supporting a local small entity versus kind of these big hotel conglomerates. And I think beyond these kind of tourism operators, I do think governments and poor governance is a big factor in the rate of tourism leakage as well. Corruption at a government level can also really contribute to this. So this is kind of where governments aren't really fostering an equitable model of tourism or incentivizing this. And they're kind of primarily allowing this model that really only benefits those in power, and that can include the government officials. And I think a third thing is our kind of individual perceptions of a place that we visit kind of in advance, or what we want from an experience. So if we have very certain expectations as we travel of the type of products that we want to see, or a certain level of service that we expect, then that kind of contributes to a demand to maybe outsource or source these products from another place, or bring in English proficient staff in order to make us feel more comfortable. So our perceptions also can be a key part.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you cannot go to Africa and not have Coca-Cola, right?
I'm sure there's probably like lots of great local beverages.
Absolutely.
And right, as a vegetarian or vegan travelers, it's kind of always exciting to see what kind of local vegetarian food you can try, or find fun ways to veganize dishes that you can find locally and pair that with a nice local beverage.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads really nicely into the different types of leakage, because that's also not a straight cut thing. There are two main kinds, if I'm right.
Yeah, there are two main kinds. And I think any of us that are familiar with these basic economic terms, we have import and export leakage. So import leakage is occurring when a tourism company, operator, or destination spends revenue that they make from tourism on importing goods, services, products, or even human resource capital like employees from outside a country or region. We typically see this in order to kind of meet travelers' expectations for specific standards. It can be done to fill key gaps in a supply chain, or honor brand contracts or existing partnerships. So, a hotel may have a 10-year contract with Coca-Cola, so they kind of have to honor this and they keep supplying that. And I think rather than supporting industries outside of tourism like agriculture, import leakage kind of contributes to a depletion in the local value chain. It can reduce jobs or income from local farmers, producers, manufacturers, or residents. And the second type of leakage is import leakage. So this typically happens when the money spent is exported out of the country. And this can be funneled through those kind of like large multinational corporations that we were talking about. So in many developing economies that are maybe interested in entering the tourism market, oftentimes these large international kind of conglomerates are the only entities that have the necessary capital to invest in tourism facilities that meet traveler-specific criteria. So that's not to say locals don't have the means or the resources, but it's maybe not at the level that travelers kind of want to see that develop. So most of the income then from maybe these like big, resorts are exported back to corporations that are headquartered elsewhere. And this kind of contributes to profits of tourism really benefiting the international tourism industry as a whole, rather than the local industry. So it kind of contributes to that, 10% GDP, it all looks great. But that's really just kind of helping these like big international numbers and not necessarily like the local numbers. And I think we're never really going to see a 0% leakage rate. Imports and exports are important for, trade and relationships. But high rates of tourism leakage, I think, leave missing opportunities to really support the development and growth of these kind of suppliers and producers locally.
Yeah, I mean, in some places, I guess it's kind of a double-edged sword, but there has to be a way to balance that, right?
Yeah, there is. And, I think there's a lot of, I guess, unnecessary leakage and avoidable leakage that we can look to close. But yeah, there are ways to do that.
Absolutely. So let's kind of jump into that a little bit. Either types of, we did talk about this a little bit, and you said cruises was one of them, and I was glad you brought that up. That, cruises are one of the, higher rates of tourism leakage, but I am assuming that there are some others that probably are high on that tick list as well too.
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit kind of about the divide between the global north, global south, or developing economies and developed economies. And I think we do really see a big divide in that. Then we'll kind of break down maybe the types of tourism. But a UN Environment Program study looked at how the leakage rate in developed economies, which tend to be in the global north, is only about 10 to 20% on average, whereas that number increases to about 50 to 60% in developing economies, which are often in the global south. However, that's not always the case. So I'm originally from Alaska, and I worked in the tourism industry there for a bit. So Alaska is in the global north. It's in the United States, which is a developed economy. And they actually have very high rates of leakage. So this is going to be some more numbers that are going to shock you. Tourism is really vital to Alaska's economy and employment. But when we start to really examine where that money is going, we identify these really critical leakage gaps. So about 50% of tourism in Alaska is cruise-based and seasonal. In one study, this was back in 2005, so the numbers may have changed since then, but this is kind of what we have to go off here, looked at a cruise port in Haines, Alaska, and for every dollar spent by cruise passengers, the community only retained 5 cents.
Oh my God, so 5 cents?
So that's significantly lower than the global average, and especially what we typically see in developed economies in the global north. So I think this kind of really, hits the note that the type of tourism and the model of tourism possibly are the most significant indicators for the rates that we see of leakage, and not necessarily like the location. And yeah, this happens in Alaska, I think, because, a lot of people don't really stay long. Some of these cruise ports are only 4 to 6 hours. You're not really going out and spending money locally. You're not staying at a hotel. And some of these cruise ports don't really have the infrastructure. They don't really have the hotels to necessarily support that. But, there are kind of ways to kind of maybe foster the development of that in a way that's more equitable. right? The cruises are already retaining about 50% of these onshore excursions. And many tourism businesses in Alaska are actually owned by seasonal residents, and they close up shop during winter. They kind of take their money with them. That's kind of an example of export leakage. And this leads to kind of this winter economic lull. And yeah, some of the goods and services offered to tourists there are also imported, cheap souvenirs, international luxury brands. So I think this is kind of a great example of how we see import and export leakage working in tandem for like a really low retention rate for the community.
Yeah, wow. I can't believe that 5 cents.
Yes. Honestly, I think I read that statistic every now and then just to make sure that I got it right, because I'm like, surely this, was a typo or something.
Right.
I go back to this document. Again, it was back from 2005, but I go back to this every now and then. I read it. I'm like, okay, this is what it says. This is what it's telling me.
Yes,
yeah.
It's crazy. I'm curious, when you mentioned that you worked in the tourism industry in Alaska, you were a guide, correct?
Yeah, I was.
Did you recognize some of this while it was happening? Or at that time, was it just what was normal, quote unquote?
Yeah, looking back, I think I was one of a handful of local Alaskan tour guides. We'll talk a little bit about the quality of jobs and the retention of jobs maybe in a bit, but I think this really kind of was a sign that a lot of Alaskans didn't want these jobs because they weren't high quality. So this was kind of my university summer job. It was seasonal. It was very high intense. And yeah, at the time I was like, that's kind of interesting that I was one of the only guides. And I even had, I used to pick up people off the cruise, and we would, all pile onto this bus, and I was the local land guide for that. And, I had a lot of people come up to me and they're like, oh, it's really exciting to have, a local Alaskan as our guide. I think that's really rare. And I was like, is it? And then I was like, oh, yeah, most of my colleagues are seasonal and they're here, just to kind of work and leave. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit about like why that is and the retention of that in a bit. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That is crazy. I feel like, and looking back too, there's a phrase for it, like, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's kind of a thing with it, with like in tourism, like looking back and you think, why wasn't anyone saying anything about that? That's like weird that some kid from New Jersey came over to like lead a glacier tour in Alaska. Like, what's this kid from New Jersey know about glaciers? So sorry, kid from
Yeah, there's so many moments back in my travel history that I'm like, yeah, why weren't we talking about that back then? But, we all learn and we all grow and, we move forward.
Yes, and you do the things like you are in order to try and make things better and make travelers more aware. So in order to hopefully make, baby steps. Do you think there are ways that governments can help reduce this? I mean, I feel like governments, tourism boards, all of them kind of have their hand in it and need to.
Yeah, definitely. I think governments, we talked a little bit about the role of corruption and fostering that model of tourism. And I think they play a really key role in policy regulation and in influencing, I think, the systems that can impact tourism leakage. So they can really examine how their policies or economic environment support the growth and utilization of local producers and suppliers. Create and support meaningful training opportunities for, careers in tourism, whether that's kind of working with local universities to have like tourism or, business management, things that focus on tourism.
Hey there, fantastic listeners. Let's hit pause on this episode for a thrilling announcement, a golden ticket to globetrot with Veggies Abroad. Veggies Abroad isn't just your go-to for vegan guides and trip planning tips. It's your passport to extraordinary small group journeys, carefully crafted by the ultimate veggie pusher and your favorite podcast host, me, Rebecca Gady-Sawicki. I've spent countless hours researching the best vegan hotels, food, and experiences, and now I'm bringing those experiences directly to you. Join me and my newfound veggie pals on escapades to exotic and exciting destinations around the world. Whether it's trekking through the Thai jungle to witness elephants in their natural habitat or exploring Iceland's famous ring road, our adventures are nothing short of spectacular. And guess what? Those aren't the only exciting trips awaiting you. So what are you waiting for? Cruise on over to veggiesabroad.com pronto. Well, how about after this episode is over to explore our dazzling lineup of tours and secure your spot today.
Implementing strategic fees and fines can help communities, retain some of these benefits. Local policymakers can really be in tune with the community, what they need, what their kind of I guess, feelings are toward tourism and how they can kind of be brought in as part of the conversation. And yeah, look at the role in corruption, which is probably a lot to ask from a government. What is your role in corruption? Gosh, yeah.
If only we could have an open and honest conversation about that. There'd be so many places that would be completely different.
Yeah. And I think DMOs, or, destination managers or tourism boards, can be really key in regards to the narrative and the stories that they tell. So they can really highlight local businesses and marketing materials. And I think storytelling is really powerful. So finding ways to tell stories about the community and the people, that they're representing. Because I think as travelers, that helps us connect to, I saw this feature about a woman who, is running her own agriculture, or farm, and she's selling to this restaurant, and I want to go to that restaurant and eat locally and eat seasonal. So kind of telling those stories is really important. Supporting local content creators to kind of share stories from their perspective of, being a resident in a destination can be really helpful. And even facilitating, business relationships, I think, between tourism operators and other sectors like agriculture. I think, tourism boards can actually kind of foster those relationships.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points. And, and I feel like too, tourism boards especially, like they have the ability to kind of change a business, so to speak, because so many of these smaller places, they don't have giant marketing budgets. They're not buying thousands of dollars of social media ads and placement in magazines and things like that. They just don't have the ability to do that. But then if a tourism board posted it on their social media account or highlights it in an article or something, that could really, have a completely different change for that business, for that person's life.
It really can. And I think tourism boards are some of the most powerful entities in tourism. And I don't know, sometimes for the good and sometimes maybe for unintended consequences, but the way that they market a destination can have such big impacts, from contributing to kind of like an unexpected tourism boom that the community is not necessarily ready for, to having more of a slow, methodical approach in thinking about how they're representing a destination, to be like really mindful and look at supporting these kind of like local systems. So they're so incredibly powerful. And I think they are really important, I guess, kind of relationship builders in developing meaningful tourism and looking at these kind of economic relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't even think about them as having that kind of a drive. And I guess, that kind of goes back to your point about talking about the bringing in the seasonal guides. So if you have a destination that's more seasonal, is really kind of pushing that, then how in the world would you be able to staff locally a job that doesn't have benefits, that probably doesn't pay super well, with people that live there?
Yeah, I got my job in seasonal work, and I don't necessarily think that seasonal work or even providing opportunities, for immigration through tourism are the issue. I think the issue really stems from, in situations where we have high rates of leakage, the jobs in tourism tend to be lower quality. So I think it's even okay to have seasonal jobs, but we want them to be a bit higher quality. And I will say, not a lot of locals really want to work seasonal jobs because they want that stable year-round employment. And I do think as we work to reduce that leakage, we will see an extension moving beyond just seasonal employment. And this is kind of moving beyond that boom and bust system. But I think the core of this is really just making sure that the jobs offered are not exploiting vulnerable populations, whether that's relying on, low-cost labor and immigrants, but rather, we welcome immigration through tourism, but these are really high quality jobs that we're welcoming them as like a resident of our community, or, looking at ways that we can balance seasonal work with maybe more stable year-long employment. So I think it's really focusing kind of on the quality of jobs that are provided and how we should be focusing, I guess, kind of on offering those really quality, high value jobs to residents, but also looking at ways that we can, kind of distribute that, I guess, throughout that economy more equitably. But
absolutely.
I hope that
do you have any good successful examples of destinations or businesses that have done some things to kind of turn this around? Now that we've talked about all of the ways that it sucks, let's flip it.
Yeah, there are a couple of really great examples. And I think some of the examples that we can find, they all kind of share these common threads. And these are the places that are leaning into community-led tourism. They're really including the local community at heads of the table, not necessarily just like, we took a survey, this is what they want. It's really including community members like as very instrumental players in tourism development. And there are places that are leaning into regenerative tourism. So in some cases, tourism resources and assets are actually being handed back to Indigenous communities. So we're seeing this happen in Kakadu, Australia, and Haida, Gwaii in Canada. And now most of the tourism offerings in both of these places with really big Indigenous populations are owned, operated, and managed by the Indigenous community. And they are able to retain these funds in a way that allows them to distribute it back through their community in a very meaningful way. It allows them to engage in land stewardship and environmental conservation in a way that aligns with their values and employs their tribal members in employment. So they're really able to kind of retain almost all aspects of this. And we're seeing them, create partnerships with Indigenous agriculture or beverage companies in Kakadu. So it's kind of creating this like value chain throughout the Indigenous community. And those are two really great examples. Destination Canada just recently kind of introduced a new wealth and well-being index. And what they're looking at doing is they want to look at 6 different kind of pillars. And within each of those pillars, there's, a handful of other elements that they're looking at. And they want to create a new metric system for looking at the value of tourism beyond just, it contributes $100 billion to our economy. They want to know what that's doing. And so they created this kind of new index, and they're looking at, is this creating meaningful jobs? Is this creating a diverse business? Is this helping our local Canadian small business succeed? Is this creating high quality tourism offerings? So they're kind of looking at redefining the economic success of tourism to see how that's actually contributing to the quality of life of their residents. So that's a really big thing. And a lot of places will implement policy or like strategic fees or fines. So Italy is a really big example of a place that loves to charge fees and fines. So if you've ever been to Italy, you've probably paid like a hotel tax. You might have paid like a day tax somewhere. They really like adding these little taxes and fees. And I think a common misconception is these are, a lot of people think these may be done to kind of alleviate mass tourism by de-incentivizing people to come. But what they do is they allow a government or a community to retain a set amount of money that they can then distribute to help manage these more impacts. Or negative impacts. So if a hotel is primarily keeping all the money, this tax as a nightly tax can actually go back into the community to help manage waste or pollution and whatnot. So taxes, fees, and fines are popping up as ways to kind of help manage this. And international tourism businesses are also looking at ways to reduce tourism leakage. So Intrepid Travel is a great example of a business that's looking at reducing tourism leakage. And they're doing this by, they support the training and certifications of local guides. They develop really meaningful community relationships, and they're monitoring their value chain closely to find ways that they can support local community. And there's lots of small group tours out there that use local guides in order to kind of connect travelers with locals. So there's lots of great examples.
Yeah, that's great. So we ran a tour to Bali last year, and before getting there, they had just implemented a similar tax like with Italy. Then I thought I saw that they pulled it back, but maybe they're still doing it. But I think it's also to try and help offset some of the detrimental effects, because they have huge infrastructure issues. If anyone's ever been to Bali, getting around it's not super fun.
Yeah, and if only those really working in tourism, even if that is a local hotel, if they're the ones primarily kind of keeping a lot of the economic benefits, it's really hard to strategically distribute that in a way that's meaningful. There's a town in Canada called Tofino, and they implemented a 1% sustainability fee. And they use those funds to actually open a new wastewater treatment facility because they were dumping raw sewage into the ocean. And this is another issue with sewage, right? But they just didn't have, it's 2,000 people. And, it's really hard to fund that kind of wastewater infrastructure with a town of 2,000. And as they kind of got this tourism boom, they were welcoming like 600,000 people, annually. And they were like, okay, tourism is part of the problem. Let's make it part of the solution. So that's another great example of how a fee can go beyond tourism and kind of help everyone. So now we're not, swimming in sewage.
Oh my gosh. Thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
Aside from governments and businesses getting involved in making a change, individual travelers do have the power of making change as well too. So how can they make sure that more of their money is staying in the local economy?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is support local. And the kind of more complicated answer of that is look for value chains and relationships. So if you're looking to support local, you can look for local guides, tour operators, locally accommodation, restaurants that serve local food, buy locally crafted souvenirs, try alternatives, try the local beverage, right? Rather than just going to your default, soda product that you're used to at home. Even if you're cruising, there are alternatives out there. So Alaska actually has a small indigenous owned cruise line.
That's cool.
A great alternative. So I think whatever your interest is, whether that is cruising or luxury resorts, there's always an alternative out there that I think is maybe I guess I don't know about better, but maybe a more equitable choice, or and even if you're really interested in all-inclusive luxury resorts, there are examples of locally owned all-inclusive resorts. So I've stayed in one in Australia, and you still kind of have your every whim catered to, but the food and the drink is all local. The employees working there are all local. So that's a really great immersive experience. So kind of look for those alternatives. So find whatever you like in travel, whether that's luxury, adventure, food, and find a kind of way to swap that out with a more local experience, and looking for those local relationships. So if you are staying at, maybe a multinational hotel chain, look for ones that do the little things. Are they stocking a local soap producer in the bathroom? Are they serving local food? And I just think these little steps, if it all kind of seems overwhelming and you're really comfortable maybe with, you have a brand allegiance or something like that, look for the ones that are doing these little steps and kind of creating these more meaningful relationships in the community. And I think beyond that, another great tip is to kind of go in with a open mind. So I think one of the best parts of traveling is that culture exchange. And if we have these preconceived notions of the type of service we want to receive or what we want to eat and drink, so kind of leaving that at the door is a great tip. Traveling off season is huge. So I talked a lot about, these seasonal jobs in Alaska. A lot of locals don't want to work them. And there are very few tourism companies that actually operate year round in Alaska that are owned and operated by local Alaskan companies. And just simply going in winter, and you can book a 5-day, tour package with one of these companies. And that really helps keep employment year round in really stable, high quality jobs that we were talking about. So just that little thing. There's one brewery in Alaska that their tap room, I think they're one of the few that have this tap room kind of in a tourism centric area that's open in the winter. And they are able to do that because a lot of travelers go there in the winter. It's a very small town, so I think they wouldn't really have that revenue to stay open. But going there in the winter and kind of supporting that keeps those people working all year. And finally, I guess speak up and ask questions is really important. So, if you're ever unsure, just a simple email to your tour guide or the company that you're booking a small group tour with, or the hotel, and just ask them, how are you supporting the local community? What steps do you take to kind of keep your supply chain as local as possible? And tell them that matters to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think always asking questions is the best way, because the moment somebody hears that this is important to somebody that has a wallet, then you plant a seed that, okay, maybe we need to think about this. And this is for so many things. And then if somebody else does it after them, then that helps reinforce the idea. There's so much with that really can help spur change. Many companies aren't going to make these changes if they don't see the necessary economic driver behind it.
And I know there's a lot of focus on, we need these big corporations to change. We need the governments to change. But I think the greatest power we have as individual travelers is how we spend our money and the demand that we create within this industry. So I think, in our current global economic setting, these companies respond to that kind of pressure. And I think, we oftentimes discredit ourselves for how powerful we can be in just speaking up, saying something and letting them know that matters to us, and just really looking at how we spend our money. So I think it's a big shift. At the beginning of this podcast, we were talking about how a lot of us go into spending money. It's good. That's all there is to it. But I think just starting that shift of, okay, how am I spending the money? Where am I spending the money? And just, kind of thinking a bit more critically before you just hand over the money and kind of think about that. And I think that's a huge step. And it is a bit of a shift, and it takes a bit of restructuring and rethinking, but I think it's a really meaningful one. And I think you just get so much more out of your travels. You have way better souvenirs and you have really enriching experiences. And at least for me, that's
a greater appreciation of where you've gone. So I'm curious, how do you normally go about planning a trip?
Oh my gosh. Oh, it's a lot of work, to be honest.
A lot of work,
yes. I start by, once I pick a destination, I really start with the basics, and I Google, or just start by kind of searching ecotourism initiatives. I start by Googling or searching for, impacts of tourism in X destination. And then I kind of start to put together this narrative, like, this destination is really struggling with these impacts of tourism. What can I do to offset or not partake in that type of behavior? And then, I look for kind of sustainable initiatives, local businesses. I think tourism boards are actually really great resources, and other, kind of sustainable content creators are great resources. And then I start to put it together this thing of, okay, these experiences, these accommodations. And then I go into the deep dive where I will actually pick a accommodation. I go to their about page. I read everything. Sometimes I even send them an email and ask them for more information. It's a lot. And I know that sounds like it maybe takes it might not be fun for some, but you don't have to always go that extreme, but just doing little things, reading about pages, I think you can get a really good feel for a company. And, there is a greenwashing element, but I think you can really just go to an about page and really get a feel for if the hotel or tour operator is genuine about what they're saying, and trust your gut based on that.
Are there certain destinations that you avoid because of issues? Or do you just try to maybe plan the trip differently so that it has a different impact?
I've never decided not to go somewhere, but I don't know if that's because that's not on my radar of something that I want to plan to do. So I don't think I've ever actively said, I really want to go here. I'm not. I maybe just choose a different destination. Like, oh, this place is doing some really good things. I would like to go there. But I think a huge part is just finding different ways to plan your travel. And so just being aware of kind of these more adverse impacts and finding ways that you can not partake in that is key. I'm trying to think if it's kind of like that cause or effect of where I go, but
maybe it's like changed your mindset. You don't even realize how your brain just operates differently.
Yeah, I feel like that's some sort of kind of psychology thing that I don't have to like take apart like why I do what I do.
I was remiss in sharing in the beginning of this that we follow each other on social media, so I already know you before. But when I first started doing research for this episode, I came across a really great guide that you wrote concerning tourism leakage, this entire topic. So I'm going to drop it in the show notes. So if people would like to read further and kind of see more of the work that you are doing, they definitely can check all of that out. But as we kind of wrap up here, are there any kind of last things that you want to leave with people as they think about planning travel for this year and ways in which to do it better?
Maybe this goes back to my obsessive researching.
I love it.
But I think there's kind of what I call like these nesting situations. And I think it's always beneficial to maybe kind of look at the overarching company that owns a property or a tour operator. So I kind of like to go up the chain to see where this goes. Because a lot of times, I look at something and I'm like, oh, this looks really like local and boutique and cute. And then you start to like, it's owned by this company, that's then owned by this company, that's then owned by this company. And, before you know it, you're kind of at this like top conglomerate. So I think kind of like go up that chain of command and see if you can find who the owner is. And that's kind of a great way to start by supporting something that's local. It's just kind of maybe a obsessive research tip.
I love it. Maybe you should do gosh, what would it be considered? A
trip planner.
Yes. I love it.
everyone would be like, oh my gosh, like we
Sooz, it was such a great time chatting with you, learning more about this. You are such a fabulous resource. Thank you so much for taking the time today to chat.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great to chat with you about this. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. If you'd also like to learn more about upcoming Veggies Abroad tours or get additional travel help, visit veggiesabroad.com and also join our newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date with loads of new content, like where to find gorgeous vegan hotels, what to eat in cities around the world, trip planning tips, and so much more. Well, that's all I've got for now. Until next time.